Hello, I'm Paul Herron. Welcome to Catching Up with Anaïs Nin. Today I want to talk about a critical issue in Nin studies, that is, what's been left out of Nin's published diaries. There are some fascinating passages unknown to the public. I want to share one of them with you today, which will shed some light on one of Nin's muses and the fiction she inspired. Now, I'm not talking about June Miller. I'm talking about Louise de Vilmorin. As you probably know, Anaïs Nin had to heavily edit her diary because her husband and other people whom she did not want hurt by scandal were still alive. However, she promised her readers that someday the complete story of the diary will be told. And 20 years later, after the death of Nin, her husband, and principal diary characters, the so-called unexpurgated diary was released. The revelations within were shocking. The sensual material absent in Diary 1 was suddenly revealed in a rather concentrated form. So one can conclude that each of these two published diaries contains one half of what Nin originally wrote. Not so. There's a ton of missing material. I should know since I have transcribed the entire 1932 original handwritten diary. So, what secrets do these unpublished passages contain? Let me tell you, treasures. And we begin with a character who inspired some of Anaïs Nin's most important fiction, the French aristocrat Louise de Vilmorin. Just who was Louise de Vilmorin? What about her is left out of the published diaries? And why is it significant to understanding Anaïs Nin's work? Let's find out. In the early 1930s, when Anaïs Nin lived in Louveciennes, a suburb of Paris, she became acquainted with a woman living in a chateau not far away. Although an adult and married, Louise de Vilmorin occupied the gaping home with her grown siblings, including two brothers, Roger and André. They had an unconventional lifestyle with strong hints of incest, and Nin, intrigued, began to record their conversations in her diary. Nin says in this unpublished 1932 entry, "Last night, because of Louise, the schema of my lyrical book burst into crystallization. Death, disintegration, perversion, lesbianism, incest, homosexuality and paralysis, death, Holocaust." And what was the lyrical book Nin mentions? None other than her first and most recognized work of fiction, The House of Incest, which would be published 4 years later. On page 43, Nin describes one of the main characters. Quote, "Dilated eyes, noble-faced profile, willful mouth, Jeanne, walking with head carried high. She sang and she laughed. I love my brother." Unquote. Yes, the incestuous aura of the Chateau de Vilmorin found its way into the House of Incest. But that's not the only book in which Jeanne appears. In Paris, Nin began writing the short stories that would make up the volume Under a Glass Bell. What most of us don't realize is that the unpublished passages of the diary reveal just how much Louise de Vilmorin inspired the title story. For instance, let's compare a few lines from the original diary to some that appear in the published version of Under a Glass Bell. Vilmorin in a 1932 diary says, "What I do for my brothers is a great joy. We cannot live without each other. If I am sick, they get sick. If they are sick, I get sick." While Jeanne in Under a Glass Bell says exactly the same thing. Is this just a coincidence? I have an idea. Why don't we listen to Anaïs Nin read this entire passage from Under a Glass Bell, while we look at the original diary inscription on screen.
John, Paul, and I. Nothing exists beyond our alliance. My own children do not mean as much to me as my brothers. I am devoted to my children only because I have given my word. I owe them that, but what I do for my brothers is a great joy. We cannot live without each other. If I am sick, they get sick. If they are sick, I get sick. All joys and anxieties are tripled. Their opinion of me and mine of them is our only standard. It forces us into a kind of heroic living. If I should ever say to Jean, "You've done a petty thing," he would kill himself. We three belong to the Middle Ages. We have this need of heroism, and there's no place for such feelings in modern life. That is our tragedy. Once I wanted to be a saint. It seemed the only absolute act left to do. For what is more powerful in me is a craving for purity, greatness. I'm not living on earth. Neither are my brothers. We are dead. We reached such heights in love that it made us want to die altogether with a loved one, and so we died. We are living in another world. Our having bodies is a farce, an anachronism. We were never even born. We have no ordinary sensual life, no contact with reality. My marriage was a farce, my brother's marriages meaningless. When my children were born, I didn't suffer. The births were difficult. I refused to take gas. I was amused. I wanted to see myself bringing children into the world. I worked hard. I felt pain, of course, but I didn't suffer like a human being. I felt pain detachedly, as if it were not happening to my body. I have no body. I have an external envelope which deludes others into thinking I'm alive. My brothers and I hate to see each other. What we like is to have long conversations together from room to room, doors open, but not seeing each other. It enrages us to meet and kiss each other in that stupid, ordinary human way, to keep up the great farce of human movements, gestures, when we are dead. And complete death would be so enjoyable, because everything we do together is an enjoyment. I can't bear to see them as bodies, to see them growing old. Once I sat writing letters, and the two of them were playing cards. I looked at them and thought, what a crime it was our being alive. It was a simulacrum. Everything was really finished long ago. We have lived already. We are far away from husbands, wives, and children. I have tried hard to love others, and I can up to a certain point, and then no further.
Who knew this? Who knew about this link between these two remarkable women? Unless you have access to the unpublished diaries. I think it's time that we consider publishing the diaries as they were originally written. I cannot think of a single reason why we shouldn't. So why was none of this important text included in Diary 1 or Henry and June? For the former, Henry Miller gives us a clue after he read an early draft of Diary 1. In a 1965 letter to Nin, he says, "Louise de Vilmorin and her family seem horrible. I would have taken them all to the guillotine myself if necessary." A letter from Nin's co-editor Gunther Stulman reveals what Vilmorin herself must have thought about her diary portrait. He says, quote, "Maybe if we can't name Vilmorin, your suggestion to cut her out is a good one," unquote. And Nin did exactly that. Vilmorin is nowhere in any of the original 7 diary volumes. And in a private conversation with me, John Herron said that in order to make Henry and June read like a novel, he cut anything not having to do with the Henry-June love triangle, including friends, completely out. So, voila, the passages were never published, despite their value to Nin's scholarship. After Nin left Louveciennes in 1935, Louise de Vilmorin went on to make a name for herself in Parisian literary circles. She was an aspiring writer, and write she did. Her 1951 novel, Madame de, was made into a movie starring Charles Boyer. And she wrote the script for Louis Malle's second film, Les Amants, which won a prize at the 1958 Venice Film Festival. While Nin didn't appreciate Vilmorin's writing, she still had some significant literary achievements. Louise de Vilmorin died in 1969, but even in death, she finds her way into Nin's diary. In her upcoming final unexpurgated diary, A Joyous Transformation, Nin mentions a 1974 promotional trip to Paris where she was interviewed by Jean Chalon, who wrote what Nin called a cruel book about Vilmorin's final years called A Young Wife at 60 Years. In real life, Chalon had become involved with the much older Vilmorin, but he was snubbed in favor of another of her late-life suitors, André Malraux. Malraux, by the way, was the famed author of La Condition Humaine. In A Young Wife at 60, he's the inspiration for the protagonist's rival. Nin writes in her 1974 diary, "So Jean was estranged and left Louise. He was her constant companion and wrote cruelly, I felt, a humiliating image of her pursuing him insanely when he did not love her anymore. How writers avenge themselves." He wrote in Young Wife at 60, "He killed her. The day before she died of a pulmonary congestion, she had a 104-degree fever, and he made her come down to dinner." I'm lucky to have discovered the literary link between Louise de Vilmorin and Anaïs Nin, and I'm happy to share what I've learned with you. Louise may be gone, but certainly not entirely. She inspired some of Nin's greatest literature, inspired passion, and she leaves behind a notable oeuvre of her own. The chateau, or the house under a glass bell, still stands today in a park in Verrières-le-Buisson, southwest of Paris. And the family name still resonates within the Parisian art scene and beyond. Louise's great-nephew, Charles, is one of Paris's hottest young fashion designers. Stay tuned for future unpublished treasures from Nin's 1932 diary. On the horizon is the untold and disturbing story of June Miller's final days in Paris. See you then.